I never thought my marriage would become something other people felt entitled to judge. To me, it had always just been normal, not wildly happy like in romantic movies, but not miserable either. We lived together in a small house, our days following a familiar rhythm. I left for work early in the morning while my husband stayed home or took on small, odd jobs here and there. He's not what society would call successful. He doesn't have a stable, high paying job. He doesn't wear suits, doesn't drive a luxury car, and doesn't have the kind of connections that impress people. From the outside, he's just an ordinary man, maybe even someone others would consider below standard by today's expectations. But to me, he's the man I chose. He's kind, quiet, and treats me with a sincerity I've rarely seen in anyone else. On days when I come home exhausted from work, he quietly makes dinner. When I'm stressed, he doesn't say much, he just sits beside me. To other people, those things might not seem like much, but to me, they're enough. Still, life doesn't always work the way we want it to, especially when you step outside into the real world, where everything is measured, compared, and judged. I work at a fairly large company. The pressure is high, the competition is intense, and most importantly, my boss is not an easy person to deal with. He's the kind of man you can size up at a glance. Successful, wealthy, and extremely confident. But along with that comes something else: arrogance. He talks about his success constantly. Meetings aren't just about work. Sometimes they turn into his personal stage to share achievements, investments, and high level connections. And what bothers me the most is the way he looks at other people. He judges people based on money, status, and appearance. If you make a lot of money, you matter. If you don't, you're almost invisible. I've heard him make countless remarks that put others down, always disguised as honest advice. Things like, in this society, if you're not good enough, you should at least know your place. Every time I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, but because I knew. Pushing back wouldn't change anything. He's my boss, the one who controls my job, my income, and so much of my life. I always tried to keep a boundary between work and my personal life. I never talked much about my husband at work, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew, if they knew, they would judge. And I didn't want my husband to become a topic for gossip. But some things are just out of your control. It all started with a completely normal conversation during lunch break. A few coworkers were talking about their families, their husbands, expensive gifts, luxury trips. I just sat there listening, occasionally smiling along, until someone turned to me and asked, "What about your husband? What does he do?" I hesitated for a moment. It was a simple question, but for me, it never was. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to open the door for judgment. So I gave a vague answer. He works freelance, nothing too fixed. I thought that would be enough to end the conversation, but it wasn't. My boss, who had been sitting at a nearby table, overheard. He turned toward me, his eyes carrying a mix of curiosity and something I didn't like. "Freelance, huh?" he smirked. "So basically, not stable, right?" The table went quiet for a moment. I felt my throat tighten, but I tried to stay calm. "He's in a transition phase with his career." He laughed. Not a warm laugh, the kind of laugh that judges. Transitioning? At that age? That's a little late, don't you think? A few people around us laughed along, probably just to keep things light. As for me, I just sat there in silence. I didn't want to argue right there, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew it would be pointless. He wouldn't understand. And worse, he could make things even harder for me at work. But from that moment on, I knew something had changed. My boss started paying more attention to me, not in a good way. Sometimes during meetings, he would make indirect comments about people with no ambition, or those who settle for an average life. And even without naming anyone, I could feel his gaze pass over me. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that as long as I did my job well, everything would be fine. But deep down, I started to feel a kind of invisible pressure. Not because I was ashamed of my husband, but because I knew this world isn't fair. And sometimes you're not judged just for who you are, but also for the person you choose to be with. I had hoped it would stop there, that he would just make a few comments and move on, that my life would go back to normal. But I was wrong. One day after work, my boss called me over. "I've been thinking about organizing a small get-together with the team," he said. Something casual, visiting each other's homes, getting to know everyone's personal life a bit better. I immediately had a bad feeling. I don't think that's really necessary, I said carefully. He looked at me, his eyes sharpening. Why not? Or is there something you don't want people to see? My heart started beating faster. It's not that, I just think everyone's probably busy. He cut me off. Then we'll start with you. I'll come by your place this weekend. It didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a decision. I froze. Our place is a bit small. I tried to come up with an excuse. He shrugged. I don't care. I just want to see what this normal life you keep talking about actually looks like. The way he emphasized the words normal life sent a chill down my spine. I knew this was no longer just a casual visit, it was a test. A kind of curiosity wrapped in judgment. Or worse, an opportunity for him to prove something. I left the office that day with a heavy feeling. On my way home, my mind kept racing. Should I refuse? Should I lie? Or should I prepare everything perfectly to avoid being judged? But then I realized the problem wasn't the house or the way we lived. The problem was the way he looked at people. And no matter what I did, he would probably still find something to judge. That night, when I walked into the house, I saw my husband sitting in the living room, quietly fixing an old lamp. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. Long day? He asked. Such a simple question. But for some reason, my throat tightened. I stood there for a few seconds, then said, "This weekend, my boss is coming over." He looked a little surprised. Really? What for? I hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I think he just wants to stop by." He nodded, not asking any further questions. "Then we should tidy up the house a bit." He said it so casually, like it was no big deal. But I knew it wasn't normal. And I had a very clear feeling that this visit wasn't going to end well. The days that followed passed with a kind of heaviness I couldn't quite explain. I still went to work like usual, still finished my tasks on time, still attended meetings, still replied to emails, but there was only one thought constantly lingering in my mind. This weekend. The closer it got, the more pressure I felt. Not the kind of pressure from cleaning the house or preparing food. Those were things I could handle no matter how busy I was. What worried me was people. The way my boss would look at my life. The way he would look at my husband. At work, he was still the same. The expensive suits, the polished watches, the stories about million-dollar deals and overseas business trips. Every time he walked into a meeting room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. People became more cautious, more careful, and more guarded. He cut me off. "Then we'll start with you. I'll come by your place this weekend." It didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a decision. I froze. Our place is a bit small. I tried to come up with an excuse. He shrugged. "I don't care. I just want to see what this normal life you keep talking about actually looks like." The way he emphasized the words normal life sent a chill down my spine. I knew this was no longer just a casual visit. It was a test. A kind of curiosity wrapped in judgment. Or worse, an opportunity for him to prove something. I left the office that day with a heavy feeling. On my way home, my mind kept racing. Should I refuse? Should I lie? Or should I prepare everything perfectly to avoid being judged? But then I realized the problem wasn't the house or the way we lived. The problem was the way he looked at people. And no matter what I did, he would probably still find something to judge. That night, when I walked into the house, I saw my husband sitting in the living room, quietly fixing an old lamp. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "Long day?" he asked. Such a simple question. But for some reason, my throat tightened. I stood there for a few seconds, then said, "This weekend, my boss is coming over." He looked a little surprised. "Really? What for?" I hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I think he just wants to stop by." He nodded, not asking any further questions. "Then we should tidy up the house a bit." He said it so casually, like it was no big deal. But I knew it wasn't normal. And I had a very clear feeling that this visit wasn't going to end well. The days that followed passed with a kind of heaviness I couldn't quite explain. I still went to work like usual, still finished my tasks on time, still attended meetings, still replied to emails. But there was only one thought constantly lingering in my mind. This weekend. The closer it got, the more pressure I felt. Not the kind of pressure from cleaning the house or preparing food. Those were things I could handle no matter how busy I was. What worried me was people. The way my boss would look at my life, the way he would look at my husband. At work, he was still the same. The expensive suits, the polished watches, the stories about million-dollar deals and overseas business trips. Every time he walked into a meeting room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. People became more cautious, more careful, and more guarded. I was no exception, but something had changed. Before, I just thought he was demanding. Now I could clearly feel the scrutiny. One time during a meeting, he looked straight at me and said, "Some people don't just work to make money, they work to elevate their lives." He paused for a moment, then continued, "If your environment is holding you back, you need to know when to step away from it." The room went silent. No one said a word. But I knew that comment wasn't random. I felt my face heat up, but I forced myself to stay calm, jotting things down as if nothing had happened. That's how I had learned to survive in that environment. Stay quiet, endure, and don't let your emotions show. But the more I stayed silent, the more I felt like I was being pushed into a corner where I didn't have many choices. That night, when I got home, I looked around with different eyes. Our small house. The old couch, worn but still clean. The wooden dining table my husband had fixed up himself from something we bought cheap. Everything felt simple. And suddenly, I found myself wondering, how would all of this look in his eyes? Like a lack of something? A sign of failure? Or simply not worth respecting? My husband was in the kitchen at the time. He stood with his back to me, focused on cooking. The smell of food filled the air, familiar and comforting. I leaned against the doorway and watched him for a while. There's something I've never told anyone. My husband wasn't always like this. He used to have a job. He used to have a stable income. But then something happened. A bad decision at work, mixed with a bit of bad luck, and he lost everything. After that, he couldn't find the right job again. Not because he didn't try, but because life isn't always fair. Some people can fall once and get right back up, but others take much longer. And during that time, they get labeled a failure. I know that. And I also know my husband is trying. He takes on small jobs, fixing things, doing odd work, sometimes helping neighbors. It's not much money, it's not stable, but it's what he can do right now. And I accept that. Not because I don't have better options, but because I know his value isn't measured by his paycheck. Not everyone sees it that way. "You're home?" His voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a small smile. He looked at me for a moment, as if he sensed something. "Everything okay at work?" I hesitated. I didn't want to bring work stress home, but I didn't want to hide it from him either. "Not really," I said. He didn't press. He just stayed quiet, waiting for me to continue. I took a deep breath. "I think this weekend won't be simple." He nodded slightly. I figured. His answer caught me off guard. "You're not worried?" I asked. He smiled, just a little. "Of course I am. But worrying won't change anything." He turned off the stove and looked at me. "I'm just myself." It sounded simple, but for some reason it made me feel both relieved and even more anxious at the same time. Because I knew the problem wasn't who he was, it was who other people thought he was. The weekend came faster than I expected. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I cleaned the house, wiped down every corner, and organized everything as neatly as I could. Not because I thought it would change the way my boss saw things, but because I wanted to protect my space. At the very least, if he came over, I didn't want to give him any obvious reasons to criticize. My husband helped too. He didn't say much, just quietly did what needed to be done. Every now and then he would ask, "Does this look okay here? Do we need to get anything else?" Everything felt like we were preparing for something unclear. Around late morning, I started to feel tense. I checked my phone several times. No messages, no calls. But that silence somehow made me even more anxious. Then, early in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. The sound made my heart skip a beat. I looked at my husband. He looked back at me. Neither of us said a word. I walked over and opened the door. And there he was, still in a perfectly tailored suit, still polished and put together, still wearing that familiar, judging look. He glanced at me, then looked past me into the house. It was a quick look, but long enough to make me feel like everything inside had just been scanned. "Not bad," he said, his tone half joking, half something else. I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or just a softened critique. "Please, come in," I said. He stepped inside. Slowly. observing. The space suddenly felt smaller, heavier. My husband walked out from inside. "Hello," he said calmly. My boss looked him up and down, a look that didn't bother to hide its judgment. "Oh, so this is your husband?" he said. "Yes," I replied. My husband extended his hand. "Nice to meet you." My boss looked at his hand for a second, then shook it, briefly, without much effort. He responded. The atmosphere instantly turned uncomfortable. I could feel it clearly. But no one said it out loud. I invited him to sit. My husband went to get some water. Everything followed the usual polite visit routine, but the feeling was anything but polite. He sat on the couch, looking around, his eyes paused on every detail. The TV, the table, the small items around the room, as if he were grading everything. "You bought this place together?" he asked. I nodded. "We're paying it off in installments." He gave a small smile. "Yeah, makes sense." My husband placed a glass of water in front of him. "Thanks." A brief silence followed. But it was enough to make the room feel suffocating. Then he started. "So what do you do?" he asked, looking straight at my husband. The tone wasn't casual. It felt more like an evaluation. I held my breath. My husband answered, "I work freelance, mostly repairs and some technical support." My boss nodded. "I'm guessing the income is not very stable?" The question was asked so casually, but it felt like a needle. My husband didn't dodge it. "It's not stable," he admitted. My boss smiled. "In this day and age, if it's not stable, that's a tough way to live." I felt my hands tighten. I knew. This was just the beginning. And this visit wasn't really a visit at all. It was the start of something much worse. The air in the living room seemed to thicken. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching out the uncomfortable silence between the three of us. My boss leaned back against the couch, holding his glass but not drinking. His eyes were no longer just observing, they were scrutinizing. Deliberately. "Freelance," he repeated, dragging out the word as if weighing it in his mind. "It sounds flexible, sure, but really it just means unstable, right?" My husband remained calm. "It depends," he replied. "Sometimes there's more work, sometimes less." My boss nodded, but his smile suggested something else. "In other words, nothing certain." I felt my stomach tighten. That wasn't a question anymore. It was a definition. A way of boxing someone into a label he had already decided was true. I glanced at my husband. He was still sitting upright, hands resting lightly on his knees, not reacting strongly. That made me feel both relieved and hurt, because I knew he was holding himself back. "So what did you do before?" my boss continued. "I used to work as a technician for a company," my husband said. "And why did you leave?" A direct question. No softness. No consideration. I immediately spoke up, trying to step in. "Well, the company went through some restructuring, so—" I was asking him, my boss cut in without even looking at me. That sentence felt like a reminder. I had no control over this conversation. I went quiet. My husband answered, "There were some changes in the company, and I decided to leave." "Decided to leave," he repeated, then let out a small laugh. "What were you forced to?" The room froze. I felt my face burn. That wasn't sarcasm anymore. That was an insult. But my husband kept his voice steady. "You can take it however you want." That response surprised me. No pushback. No explanation. He simply didn't let anyone else control the narrative. My boss raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by that response. But he didn't stop. If anything, he seemed even more interested. "Let me be honest," he said, setting his glass down and leaning forward slightly. "These days, a man without a stable job, it's hard to call him the provider." Every word, clear, unfiltered. I felt my heart start pounding. I wanted to say something, to push back, to defend my husband. But my throat felt tight. Part of me was afraid of making things worse, afraid it would affect my job, afraid of the consequences. And that silence made me feel even worse. My husband didn't look at him. He looked down at the table, then said, "Everyone contributes in different ways." "Sure," my boss nodded, "but society doesn't see it that way." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "People look at results, income, achievements. That's what proves your value." That statement felt like a declaration. Something he believed in completely, and something he used to judge others. I clenched my hands. "I don't think it's always like that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, his eyes sharpened. "Oh? You think otherwise?" I hesitated for a second, but I still answered, "I think a person's value isn't just about money." A pause. Short, but heavy. Then he laughed. That's what people say when they don't have much of it. That line felt like a slap. Not loud, but it stung. I felt my eyes heat up, not because I was insulted, but because I knew he was insulting the man sitting next to me. The man I loved, the man I chose. My husband stayed silent. He didn't react, didn't argue, didn't show any sign of irritation. But that silence was exactly what made it unbearable for me. My boss continued. I don't mean to offend, he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I'm just stating the truth. He looked straight at my husband. A man who can't provide a better life for his family should at least have a clear plan. I couldn't take it anymore. He is trying, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm enough. He turned to me, frowning slightly. Trying is good, he said, but results are what matter. He paused, then added, You're still young, you still have options. Don't let yourself be dragged down by the wrong choices. That statement crossed a line. It wasn't just judgment anymore. It was interference. In my life. In my marriage. I felt my whole body tense up. I wanted to stand to end the conversation. But I didn't. I stayed there, frozen. My husband turned to look at me. His expression was calm, no blame, no anger. Just calm, and somehow that made me feel even worse. My boss seemed to notice the silence, and he continued, his tone softer but no less sharp. I've met a lot of people like you, he said, looking at my husband. They're usually pretty content with where they are. He gave a faint smile. No ambition, no pressure. And then life just passes them by. I could feel every word carefully shaping an image he wanted to impose. My husband looked up. For the first time, he met my boss's eyes directly. Not everyone is the same, he said. His voice was still calm, but there was something different now, a quiet strength. My boss raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what makes you different? That question wasn't meant to understand. It was meant to challenge, to corner him. I held my breath. My husband didn't answer right away. He looked at him for a few seconds, then said, I don't think I need to prove that. A short response, but enough to shift the atmosphere. My boss went quiet for a second. Then he laughed. That's interesting, he said. Very interesting. But that smile wasn't friendly. It was more like someone who had just found a new game to play. I knew this wasn't going to end here. And what I was feeling right now wasn't just discomfort, wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper, a kind of anger, quiet, but building. The air in the room was no longer just uncomfortable. It felt heavy, like any word could shatter everything. My boss leaned back against the couch, but his eyes were anything but relaxed. He looked at my husband like he was evaluating an object, not a person. Let me be honest, he said, his voice slow but cold. I've met a lot of people like you. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. At first, they all have reasons, circumstances, but in the end, they're all the same. A faint smirk appeared on his lips. They settle for less, and then convince themselves it's enough. I felt my chest tighten. That wasn't a comment anymore, that was a direct insult. I turned to look at my husband. He was still sitting there, back straight, his expression so calm that I couldn't even tell what he was thinking. And that calmness made me even more worried. My boss continued, showing no intention of stopping. Honestly, I don't even blame you, he said, his tone almost sounding like sympathy. Not everyone has what it takes to move up. He shrugged, but the problem is, when you don't have that ability, the least you can do is know your place. That sentence landed like a cut, clear, cold, unfiltered. I couldn't take it anymore. Sir, I started, but my husband gently reached under the table and touched my hand. Such a small gesture, but enough to stop me. I turned to look at him. He didn't look at me. His eyes were still fixed on my boss. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't just silence anymore. It was intention. He spoke. His voice was still calm but clear. You're partly right. That answer surprised both me and my boss. My boss raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. Oh, so you finally agree with me? My husband shook his head. Not exactly. He leaned back a little, still composed. It's true that some people choose to stop, but not everyone who stays quiet does so because they can't move forward. A brief pause. Then he continued. Some people just don't feel the need to prove it to others. The room went quiet. Not the same tense, awkward silence from before. This time, it was real. A pause that actually meant something. My boss didn't smile right away. He studied my husband more carefully, like he was really listening for the first time. That sounds philosophical, he said after a few seconds. But reality is different. My husband nodded. It is. Reality is always different. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. But I think success isn't always something you can see in just a few minutes of visiting someone's home. That statement wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but it was sharp. I felt my heart start racing. My boss narrowed his eyes. So you're saying I'm wrong? My husband didn't answer directly. He simply said, I think you're looking at things from a perspective you're used to. A very careful answer. Not denying, but not agreeing either. My boss laughed, this time more openly, but without the ease he had earlier. Then what's your perspective? He asked. My husband was quiet for a second, then said, not rushing to judge someone when you don't know their full story. Silence fell over the room again, but this time it wasn't the same. Something had shifted. I realized my boss was no longer completely in control of the conversation. He was still sitting there, still the one with status, but he no longer had the upper hand. And my husband, he was still the same quiet man, still that same calm voice. But somehow, he had brought everything back into balance. And for the first time since the visit began, I didn't feel embarrassed anymore. Instead, I felt something else. Something I didn't expect. Pride. Subtle, but unmistakable. The silence stretched for a few more seconds, but this time it didn't make me uncomfortable. On the contrary, I could feel a clear shift. My boss didn't speak right away. He looked at my husband longer than usual, as if reconsidering something. But there was still doubt in his eyes, still that familiar sense of looking down on him that he hadn't quite let go of. Sounds nice, he finally said, his tone slower than before. But in reality, life doesn't run on words. My husband gave a slight nod. I agree. The answer was quick, simple. No argument, no pushback, but no retreat either, and somehow that made the atmosphere even harder to read. My boss frowned slightly, as if he had expected something stronger, some kind of resistance he could push against. But my husband didn't give him that. He just sat there, calm, as if none of what had been said had shaken him. And then he continued. To be fair, you're right about one thing, my husband said, his voice steady. Life does have standards that everyone can see. My boss smirked slightly, as if he thought my husband had finally come around. But my husband went on, but not everything that has value fits into those standards. I turned to look at him. There was nothing aggressive in the way he spoke, but every word felt solid. Not the kind of words you use to fight back, the kind you say when you know exactly where you stand. My boss crossed his arms and leaned back, his eyes never leaving my husband. For example? He asked. My husband didn't answer right away. He glanced around the room. His eyes moved past the table, the shelf, then stopped at a corner near the window, where an old computer sat, the one he used all the time. You see that computer? He asked. My boss glanced at it, then nodded slightly, almost dismissively. So? I use it for work, my husband said. My boss let out a laugh. What kind of work can you even do with that thing? The question was clearly dismissive, but this time my husband didn't avoid it. He stood up. Slowly. He walked over to the computer. The air in the room seemed to follow each of his steps. I didn't know what he was about to do, but I could feel it. Something was about to happen. He turned the computer on. The screen lit up after a few seconds. Not fast, not modern, but enough. He clicked through a few things, then turned the screen toward my boss. I do remote system work for a few clients, he said. My boss narrowed his eyes slightly as if trying to see more clearly. That's it? He asked. My husband didn't answer right away. He pressed a few more keys. A list appeared. Lines of text, numbers, project names, nothing flashy, but enough that someone who knew what they were looking at would notice. My boss went quiet. He wasn't smiling anymore. This is, he asked, his voice lower now. Projects I'm currently working on, my husband replied. A brief pause. Then he added, most of them are for overseas clients. I could see the shift on my boss's face. Subtle, but real. That earlier confidence wasn't quite the same anymore. So the income is not bad, I assume, he asked, his tone no longer as certain. My husband gave a small shrug, enough to live on. A familiar answer. But this time, it carried a completely different meaning. My boss stared at the screen for a few more seconds, then leaned back, saying nothing. The room fell into silence again. But this time, that silence didn't belong to him anymore. I could feel that clearly. My husband returned to his seat. He didn't look proud, didn't offer any further explanation, as if he didn't need to prove anything. And somehow, that was exactly what changed everything. My boss cleared his throat. So, why not work for a bigger company? He asked. With your skills, you could easily. My husband cut in, but not rudely. I did. A short answer, but enough to stop the question in its tracks. He looked straight at my boss, but I chose a different path. No long explanation, no storytelling, just a statement. My boss didn't respond right away. He looked at my husband, this time not with the same judgment as before, but with caution, a realization that things weren't as simple as he had assumed. I sat there, feeling something rise inside me, something hard to describe. All the things I had worried about before, all the things I was afraid would be judged, suddenly didn't matter anymore. Not because my husband had just proven something, but because of the way he did it. No noise, no showing off, no putting others down to lift himself up. Just the right moment. And enough. My boss let out a small laugh, but this time it wasn't as confident as before. Seems like I may have judged too quickly, he said. It sounded like an admission, and I knew. For him, that was already a lot. My husband just gave a slight nod, no response, no attempt to strike back. And somehow, that was what truly put my boss in an uncomfortable position. Because when you're used to standing above others, losing that position leaves you not knowing where to stand. And for the first time since he stepped into our home, I saw him, silent, truly silent. The room fell into a long pause. No one spoke after my boss's half-hearted admission. But this silence wasn't like the others. It didn't belong to dominance anymore. It was a kind of emptiness, when the person who once held control no longer knew what to say next. My boss sat there, hands clasped together, no longer scanning the room like before. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up at my husband. I could see it clearly. He was trying to regain his position. Either way, he began, his voice less certain now, freelancing still isn't a long-term solution. He emphasized each word, as if trying to pull the conversation back onto familiar ground. No stability, no guarantees, and most importantly, no recognition. That line sounded familiar, like a final attempt to hold on to the values he had always believed in. My husband didn't react right away. He just looked at him, calm, but no longer avoiding. What do you think recognition is? He asked. The question caught my boss off guard for a brief moment. Status. Achievements. When people look at you and know who you are, he replied. And if you don't have those things, my husband asked. Then, he frowned slightly, it's hard to say you're successful. My husband gave a small nod, as if he had heard enough. Then he said, his voice still calm but clear, then I guess we just define things differently. A simple statement, but this time it wasn't defensive. It was a declaration. My boss laughed, but the smile didn't feel natural anymore. So you're saying I'm wrong? My husband shook his head. No, I'm just saying, your perspective isn't the only one. The tension returned. But this time I didn't feel suffocated like before. Instead, I could feel something shifting. My boss was no longer in the higher position. At least, not in this room. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then suddenly laughed, but this time it sounded forced. That's interesting, he said. Someone without a clear position, talking about perspective. The comment was meant to attack, but it lacked the sharpness it once had, like a dull blade. My husband didn't react harshly. He simply said, maybe I don't have the kind of position you recognize. A pause. But that doesn't mean I don't have value. That sentence landed softly, but its weight was undeniable. I could see my boss's hand tighten, a quick, subtle reaction, but enough to show his discomfort. He wasn't used to this. Not used to being put in this position. Not used to people not being affected by his words. And maybe even less used to being challenged without having an easy way to respond. What do you think? He suddenly turned to me. The question caught me off guard. I didn't expect him to pull me into this. His eyes locked onto mine, as if testing which side I would take. I felt my heart racing. This was the moment I had feared from the very beginning. The moment I had to choose, between my job and my family, between safety and truth. I looked at my husband. He didn't say anything, didn't signal, didn't pressure me. He just looked at me, calmly. And somehow that was enough. I turned back to my boss. I took a deep breath. I began, my voice slightly shaky but clear, everyone has their own way of living. He didn't say anything, just looked at me. I continued, and I don't think it's right to judge someone based only on what you see in a single visit. Silence. Long. Very long. I could feel it clearly. I had just crossed a line. My boss didn't smile anymore. His face hardened, not out of surprise, but because he wasn't pleased. I see, he said, his voice noticeably colder. So you think like him too. It wasn't a question, it was a conclusion. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The air in the room felt so tense, like one more word could shatter everything. My boss stood up, abruptly, without warning. I think I've seen enough, he said. His voice was calm, but cold. Very cold. I stood up too, out of reflex. I I didn't know what to say. There was nothing that fit. No way to fix this situation anymore. My husband remained seated. He didn't rush to stand, didn't rush to walk him out. He just watched. My boss walked to the door, paused for a second, then turned back. His eyes swept over both of us. The obvious disdain from before was gone, but there wasn't respect either, just distance. I hope, he said slowly, you know what you're doing. The words were directed at me, but the meaning was much deeper. Then he opened the door, stepped outside. The door closed behind him, not a loud sound, but final. The room fell into a strange kind of silence. I stood there for a few seconds, not moving, not speaking. What I felt inside was hard to describe. It wasn't exactly relief, but it wasn't as heavy as before either. Just a kind of emptiness after everything had already happened. I'm sorry, I said, almost out of reflex. My husband looked at me. For what? For letting this happen. He shook his head. That's not your fault. His voice was still calm, just like it had been the entire time. I sat down, let out a long breath. But my job. I didn't finish the sentence. But we both understood. This wasn't over, and I didn't have to wait long to find out. On Monday morning, when I walked into the office, I could already feel the difference. No one said anything directly, but the looks were there. Some coworkers looked at me longer than usual. Others avoided eye contact altogether. And when I walked into the meeting room, my boss was already there. He looked at me, just for a second, then looked away. No expression, no greeting, nothing. The meeting went on as usual, but I knew everything had changed. No one needed to say it out loud. I understood. The line had been redrawn, and this time I was no longer standing in the safe zone. The days that followed weren't easy. I won't pretend everything was fine right away or that I wasn't affected by what happened that day. My work changed, not in an obvious, confrontational way, but in subtle ways. Fewer important assignments, my name mentioned less in meetings, and sometimes those strange, uncomfortable silences when I walked into a room. No one said anything, but everyone knew, and I knew too, that the decision I made that day to stand by my husband came with a price. There were times I sat alone and wondered, should I have stayed silent? Would things have been easier if I hadn't said anything? Those aren't easy questions to answer, but every time I think about it, I go back to that moment. The moment I truly saw my husband, not the way others see him, but who he really is. Calm, composed, never needing to raise his voice, never needing to prove himself with grand words, and yet steady enough that nothing could shake him. And I realized something. Maybe, before that, I had also been seeing him the way society does. Not with judgment, but with worry, with those quiet questions about why he wasn't successful in the way people define it, with those moments when I wished he would change just a little to fit those outside standards. And that realization made me feel guilty, because while others judged him from the outside, I, the one closest to him, should have been the one who understood him best. But I hadn't always been. I stayed silent when my boss first started making those remarks. I hesitated when he was being judged, and I only spoke up when things had already gone too far. That night, after everything happened, we sat together for a long time. We didn't say much, just sat there, quiet. I'm sorry, I said, not because of the visit, but for everything before that. He looked at me, tilting his head slightly like he didn't understand. Why are you apologizing? Because I didn't stand up for you sooner. Saying that made my throat tighten. He was quiet for a moment, then gave a small smile. I don't need you to protect me, he said. But I want to, I replied. He looked at me a little longer. No blame, no sadness, just calm. You were there, he said. That was enough. A simple sentence, but it made me feel so much lighter. And from that moment, I understood something. that strength isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about knowing who you are and not letting anyone else define that for you. My husband didn't need to prove he was successful by someone else's standards. He didn't need to argue to win. He just needed to be himself. And that was strong enough. As for me, I learned to see things differently. I began to understand that not everyone who has money, status, or recognition is worthy of admiration. And not everyone who lives simply and speaks little is lacking. There are values that can't be measured by money. There are people who can't be judged in just a few minutes. And there is a kind of silence that isn't weakness, but a choice. A choice not to lower yourself to things that aren't worth it. After everything, what made me reflect the most wasn't the way my boss behaved. It was the way I used to see life. I used to think that as long as I did my job well, stayed quiet, and avoided conflict, everything would be fine. But I was wrong. There are times when silence isn't the answer. There are times when you have to speak up, not to win, but to protect what matters. And for me, the man sitting beside me that day was what mattered most. I don't know what will happen with my job in the future. Maybe I'll have to face more challenges. Maybe I'll have to start over somewhere else. But there's one thing I'm sure of. If I had to choose again, I would do the same. Because no job, no position is worth turning your back on the person you love. And if anyone asks me, after everything that happened, what I've learned, my answer is simple. Never judge a person based only on what you see. Never think that status gives you the right to look down on others. And never confuse silence with weakness. Because sometimes the quietest people are the ones who make you rethink everything.